I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and here are your data points.
We are in July of 2025, and the Trump administration has now taken its first and most significant step toward developing U.S. policy on artificial intelligence. The administration just released its AI action plan after revoking Biden's AI executive order earlier in the year. Complementing the AI action plan, the Trump administration also signed a couple of executive orders that were focused on accelerating permitting for AI data centers, promoting export of AI-based tech, and restricting the federal purchase of AI systems that were deemed to have ideological bias. Lots of things to dive into. While the plan itself is not law, it does provide an outline of where the administration's priorities lie and where we expect to go as federal policy on AI over the course of at least the next 4 years. To discuss the plan and where we go from here, I have invited my partner, Cybil Roehrenbeck, to the podcast. Cybil is a partner in our government relations practice and has spent many years both working on the Hill and working with companies both at law firms and at trade associations track and develop AI policy. Cybil, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Scott. Excited to talk about this today.
Cybil, this is an area that you know very well. You organize many events around policy and AI. And so before we dive maybe more deeply into what the White House has released in the AI action plan, maybe it'd be helpful just to kind of set a backdrop of what the federal policy has been around AI. There's been, areas that there's been a lot of discussion around state preemption. There was funding in the One Big Beautiful Bill. From your perspective, prior to the release of the action plan, what was the administration signaling about where AI would go in the U.S. policy realm?
Sure. Thanks, Scott. So I think, the big thing has been, let's not tie our hands too much so that we can continue as the United States to compete in the global AI race and do that in a way that's going to incentivize innovation, incentivize companies, and not bog us down. We did have, as you mentioned, that AI plan that came out of the Biden administration, which was really focused on new, regulations and compliance matters that many in this space felt, were unduly sort of tying the hands of some innovators and not responsive to some of the main issues around AI capabilities, such as energy and how we can effectively utilize these technologies while also growing jobs rather than losing jobs. And so even before the AI action plan came out, as you mentioned, we had a series of executive orders. One of those repealed what President Biden had done or pulled it back. And the other really laid out in very broad strokes the Trump administration's goals around AI. We want to remain competitive with some of our with APAC and some of our Asian partners. We want to make sure that we are incentivizing American innovation and growing and putting our regulatory prowess maybe to areas where we can deregulate and make things easier and less burdensome and more up to date. So that was the general scope of that EO. We had a big debate as part of the reconciliation bill, which became the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which just passed on July 4th of this year, around, what should federal law in the space of AI look like, and also what should state law look like. We've seen in a number of states that new rules around bias mitigation, AI safety, energy constraints, some of those things have been introduced in states. There was a lot of legislative activity in the state of California last year into this year around AI. And so there was a growing concern, I think, amongst many developers and companies that we were looking at a 50-state patchwork of laws that could potentially really thwart innovation and be cumbersome for companies to comply with. Particularly smaller companies. A lot of the companies that I work with are startups that are really, very narrowly focused in terms of what their AI model does, and trying to navigate, such a diverse group of state laws was proving troublesome. So there was this thought, well, do we need a federal plan? And can we kind of pause some of the state activity in light of that? We did look through a number of bills that were pending in the Congress, and they were really kind of all over the place. The ones that really stood out as the reconciliation bill or One Big Beautiful Bill Act were being debated. There was one provision, the AI moratorium, that really stood out. That would have basically preempted state law related to AI and kind of opened the door for future federal legislation in this space. That was hotly debated. It did make it through the House passed version of the bill, but when it got to the Senate, it ran into a few significant roadblocks. The provision was amended a number of times and tied ultimately to a smaller funding package, which was, important for it to be included as a measure procedurally in that bill. But ultimately, if it fell off, it was not passed. So as we're teeing up towards the AI action plan, that's kind of a big topic that we're thinking about as we have a new outline of federal activities in the action plan. What does that mean in terms of upcoming federal legislation? And that's something we're watching closely.
Yeah, very interesting. So if I'm getting it right, there is interest at the federal government level of stepping into the space of AI legislation. Exactly what that looks like, I think, is still a giant TBD, but an area where, hey, listen, the states, the testing ground for all of this, the laboratory of legislation may not work as well in the tech sector. We certainly have a lot of experience with that in the privacy world, where we are dealing with 50 different versions, or at least kind of a significant number of versions of different privacy obligations that are not preempted by the federal government. So that idea of, well, let's put a pause on what the state's doing while the federal government acts, sounds like that lost the steam in the Senate, but if I'm understanding correctly, may not be out of the question for future legislation.
Yes. And so, the argument has been, and you probably be able to vet this argument better than I can, but, this is not an area where states, should be having their own rules and regulations. It's very different than some other sectors where we might have, for example, medicine, where we have state-based rules around the practice of medicine and what that means. And other types of industries. This isn't like a licensure area. This is an area where, much like the internet, this is the argument. Like the internet, if you had a patchwork of rules that was very different in every single state, that could be very problematic because this is really interstate commerce. And so that's the discussion. I think, some people have said it's actually positive that it wasn't included in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, that the AI moratorium wasn't, because there it would be tied to funding, and that really wasn't ideal, and it was not the purest version of what the AI moratorium should be. So I do think that folks who are interested in advancing that are going to continue to push it, and we could see it reemerge toward the end of this year. There's a number of different ways that they could do it. They could make it industry specific. So we do have industry type bills that are sort of moving forward, or funding bills that are based on different subject areas. So example, the National Defense Authorization Act is moving forward, and they have to act on that this year. There's a number of different ways procedurally that they could include it in a piece of legislation. The big pushback against it from the members of Congress who, kind of raised their hand at concern and really fought against it being included. There were a number of things, but one of the things was, how can we preempt state law if we don't have a federal law? We don't have federal constraints. We don't have our agencies working on regulation in this space. So how can we really do that? How can we really preempt the states from acting when the federal government hasn't acted? And so in some ways, you might think of the AI action plan as sort of standing in that role, and the conversation may be different now that we do have the agencies working to, implement 90 different directives that were included in this AI action plan that came out last week.
And maybe that's a good way of transitioning to understanding what is in that plan, because, as you're describing the plan and contrasting it against what Biden had included in his executive order, you can look at AI and be very optimistic, right? Think about all of the many things that it's going to do for human efficiency, for areas of creating all this untapped value that we have never really explored. You could look at that same technology and say, oh, look at all of the risks that are associated with this technology and all of the ways that this can, do harm by us. And what is very interesting about this, and you to put these two things side by side, you're seeing that debate play out in two different versions of the AI policy. You have a Biden one, which I would kind of read as a very cautious view of like, well, hey, AI has a lot of promise, but has a lot of risk. And let's try to make sure that we are being slow to act, right? Maybe not be the first mover, perhaps, and be in a position where we can adopt it, but with a lot of oversight and, perhaps red tape. Trump White House says, this red tape is only going to hinder us. We are in a competitive global marketplace to develop this. Let's focus on the positive, and kind of pushed and reformulated how they were thinking about the risks to a risk that, frankly, the Biden administration didn't spend any time thinking about it. So interested in your perspective on the themes that came out of the AI action plan from your perspective, and perhaps what of that could be the foundation for that federal legislation that you mentioned.
Yeah. So, I think the thing is, some people believe this is the next great industry, and all indications point to that is certainly true. We want those companies here in the United States. This is the perspective of the administration, and not going elsewhere. Since the Biden plan came out, we did have the AI Act come out in the EU, and we saw a lot of companies kind of balk at some of the new requirements that were put in place there. And so we want to make sure that innovation, those companies are founded here, headquartered here, working here, and that we have that industry. So in terms of the plan, there were really three main pillars, and then within that, there were more discrete policies and kind of going down from there, really very specific directives to the agencies. The main pillars were that, the administration and the White House they were looking to accelerate innovation. They really wanted to try to make this a place where companies can come and innovate and be free to do so. They want to build the American AI infrastructure. And so that's really, do we have the energy here to run these types of models? Environmental concerns, all those things. Have we thought about all those things to ensure that companies can be here and that the full, suite of what AI companies require can take place domestically? And then the last pillar was really around security. So how do we lead in international diplomacy and security? There are a lot of, as you mentioned, concerns around how AI can be utilized by our, adversaries on a national security level, defense issues around utilizing AI. And so how can we lead in that space as well and make sure that we're protecting American data, American cybersecurity concerns are really dealt with appropriately. That was also a key pillar of the plan. Within that, I'd say there were four, really high-level policies that are included. The first one is that we want to be in a position as the United States of exporting American AI. And so there's a lot in the plan that directs both the U.S. Department of State and the Commerce Department to partner very closely with industry to have full AI, what they're calling export packages. So that would include hardware, models, software, and standards. We want to be in the business of having really strong, well-regarded AI that we can then export, globally. The second part was really thinking about, okay, it's great to have these algorithms, but there's a lot of energy is required to actually be the engines of these models. And so how do we prepare for that? So there's a lot of thinking and there are policy directives related to how do we build out data centers and what is really needed on a regulatory front to be able to do so. So there's information in the plan around expediting and modernizing data center permits, thinking about new national initiatives that would really incentivize careers in this area. So we want to make sure that we have the workforce that's needed to be able to manage and create and design these data centers and some of these semiconductor units as well. So that's another key policy. The third one is around and is a little bit broader, but it's key to this administration's focus on, and frankly, the first Trump administration's focus as well on deregulation. So how do we enable innovation by removing federal regulations that don't make sense anymore? And this is, again, kind of relates back to this concept of the state law moratorium. How do we make sure that if we have regulations or other rules on the books that are not going to be, they're going to hinder and not help this plan, how do we get rid of those or think about how to change them and update them? And how can we work with the private sector to better understand some of the gaps there?
Yeah. And maybe that's a really, interesting dynamic, right, between the regulation and the innovation. And, I think it's not so long in our human history where we look about how, frankly, the internet or tech sector had developed since the mid 90s, and the regulatory, effectively deregulatory environment that we had that fostered that innovation, which happened here in the United States primarily, and not in other areas of the world, namely Europe, where there was much more of a regulatory overhang. And so, question would be, were those two things, is that just a correlation or is that causation, right? And probably lots of debate about that. And the same debate is happening with respect to AI, as you know well, where, those risks that people fear from AI, tend to, in some ways, lead the conversation as opposed to the promise of AI. And that's not the way I think this is set up, right? There's some specific risks that you're mentioning, and I'm interested in hearing a little bit more about them that the Trump administration is looking at, but it's very much a focusing on how do we harness the promise as opposed to the risk of AI.
100%. In terms of risks, I would say there's a couple that they really hone in on the plan. One is around free speech. And so, a lot of the activity that's happened on social media and on some of the larger forums, we've seen AI models there, responding to assertions by public officials and saying that they're false and later having to dial that back. Some of those things, I think, the administration acknowledges that there should be guidelines in place there, but also to allow free speech. And so on the speech question, there is some significant discussion in the plan that talks about how such systems should be fully objective, free from a top-down ideological bias, which I think is something that is universally agreed upon depending on how it's implemented. There's also, this thought about, well, how do we protect our data? There's intellectual property concerns, on the national security front, and we've discussed this before, like, these models are only as good as the data that you're putting into them, but then the data is there, and who can manipulate that data, who can then manipulate the algorithms. That's all. There's a lot of security issues related to that. As we're thinking about agents or autonomous models too, thinking about how a foreign country could potentially manipulate something like that's being utilized either by the federal government or by American citizens. I think those questions are top of mind as well. That's why they had, the State Department really heavily working on this, as well as the Office of Science and Technology Policy and the AI and Crypto czar.
I think that's a good summary, but maybe the things that are missing, right, which is important kind of thing, because I think a lot of the debate around AI policy focuses on bias for sure, but it's not ideological bias. It's going to bias against, minorities, individuals in different classes of people, based on a variety of ways of calculating that, whether that's age, whether that's race, whether that's education, kind of a variety of ways of thinking about bias. But that's a new way of thinking about bias that I think was introduced here. The second is that there's not a lot of discussion around privacy. in the way that that would have been a focus of one of the Biden, areas of pillars, around accuracy and safety and kind of governance and all of the stuff that would need to be in place to try to look at how this technology is being used and the ways that it could be used in more malicious ways. There's focuses on that around security, maybe from a national security perspective, from a cybersecurity perspective, from an ideological bias perspective, but not as much in some of those other areas. So it's a reframing of some of those issues that we have known and have been at the core of the EU AI Act, the core of the California discussions, a lot of the state level conversations, but not really the focus of the AI plan. So from your perspective, if you're saying like, is that then essentially going to be added back once we start having a federal legislation conversation about this? Or do you sense that the mentality here is focus on the promise and the economic benefits as opposed to necessarily the risks associated with that?
I think the focus will be on don't let American data leave American borders. Now, you understand better than I do, is that actually a practical thing? How do we police that? But it's going to be less about new requirements on American companies other than how they push out data. It'll really, I think, be a lot of that will be country specific. And we've already seen some of that, right, from the Department of Justice put out a rule earlier this year around exports of data to China and maybe some other countries. And so, in terms of new rules that they'll come up with as well, I was struck that, we only we have a bunch of agencies, and they're the same agencies that were called upon in the Biden plan are being called upon here as well. So we have NIST, National Institute of Standards. That's going to be writing a lot. They're going to be writing a lot of the rules within commerce. Like the same people that were writing many of the rules through Biden are going to be doing it here. And so will they still have privacy constraints? Probably, but will they be dialed way back from what they had worked on with Biden? I think certainly. That's much less of the focus.
Yeah, I think fascinating, how that will go. And my guess is that as you include more stakeholders in any type of federal legislation, obviously those different points of view are going to need to be represented as well. Maybe as we kind of wrap here, you mentioned, right, that a lot of this is directing federal agencies to take specific actions. And you mentioned this, there's a host of others. The Biden administration basically did the same thing. Very few of those things actually manifested into any enforceable or concrete specific set of actions. From your perspective, does that change, or does the federal government move as slow as it typically does to try to come out with these types of new directions? And, will the Trump administration have more success in moving the much heavier federal regulatory system forward to try to get out ahead of AI issues, and in particular to implement the plan?
I think we'll see a ton more activity for two reasons. One, with this administration, we've seen a willingness and focus on moving forward quickly on different policy matters. And so I think that it's quite clear this is a priority for the president, and there'll be a directive to actually implement these very detailed directives. Secondly, we have the money. So in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, there was a lot of money that was authorized, appropriated out for much of this agency activity. So, for example, in the energy sector, there was $150 million that was given to the Secretary of Energy to write some of these rules. And that's just through next year. There likely will be much more coming. And the Department of Defense, billions of dollars were put in that bill to really include AI as part of what the DoD is working on. So new sort of test bed might not be the right word for it, but test resource management center is what they're calling it for AI within the Department of Defense. $250 million just for the advancement of AI ecosystem. All this money can be used to write these rules and really set up some of the frameworks that were delineated in the AI action plan. So we have a lot that already the agencies have the resources to really implement, which I think, really kind of partners up nicely from the administration's perspective.
And Cybil, one of the many things that you do is you help, clients be able to not only track, but also help develop and provide their voice into policymaking. This sounds like it's a rather unique moment in time at the early stages of what potentially could be the framework for AI policy for the next generation. From your perspective, where do you feel like companies may consider engaging in this conversation, and how best can they do that?
So one, looking at how the federal government is going to be utilizing AI internally, there's a ton of new sort of government contract opportunities, both coming from the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, but also that have been sort of outstanding since the beginning of this administration. Every person in this administration at the political level has been, made to understand that integrating AI and making the agencies more efficient is a really key, important piece of what this administration wants to try to do. So I think that is number one, just trying to see if there's anything that you could do working with maybe another partner, a capability that a longstanding federal government contractor has had, but they now need to integrate AI. That's a big opportunity for companies, and we try to help companies understand that opportunity. Also, I think we see a significant openness and receptiveness from policymakers and lawmakers around, well, what are the roadblocks for AI companies? We want to deregulate. We want to make things not necessarily easier, but up to date in terms of what these companies need and what their users need and the protections that the users need. So I think, talking with policymakers, there's more than any ever before for clients, we're seeing a receptiveness of like, oh, what's your problem? Can you send me a write-up of that? Let's do legislation on that. Let's get something introduced. Like, they're very interested in working on these issues. And I'd say both on the R&D side, there's a lot of interest in this topic. And so there's plenty of opportunities to get engaged. And over the next several years, I think that will persist, but we'll get to a point where we have our framework and we have our rules, and then it's going to pull back a little bit. So really now is the time for a lot of these companies to get in and get speaking with some of the folks in Washington.
That sounds like good advice. Cybil, I really appreciate your sharing both your expertise and experience with our audience, in particular, how organizations may see this as an opportunity, not only to harness the power of AI, but also to make sure that their concerns with the uses of it, or the limitations on how they may be able to use it effectively, are being appropriately addressed at the policy level. So really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Scott.
With that, I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and those were your data points.